In all of history, no battleship had ever hit another battleship from 14 miles away. The 9th of July, 1940. The Ionian Sea, 30 nautical miles east of Cape Punta Stilo, off the very toe of the Italian boot. A British battleship trains her 4 turrets on the modernized flagship of Mussolini's fleet. The ship is 27 years old. She was laid down before aircraft even carried bombs. She fought at Jutland in the last war, and the advocates of air power had long ago written her off as a floating museum piece. Her own crew called her the Old Lady. Across the water sits the Giulio Cesare, and on paper she is better in every way. Her shell is heavier, her muzzle velocity higher, her rated speed greater, her rangefinders more accurate. Behind the Italians lie hundreds of bombers on the airfields of Calabria, only a few dozen miles away. The Italian naval staff had worked it all out in advance and reached one conclusion. In a long-range engagement, the British flagship would be straddled first. The calculation was done carefully. It accounted for armor thickness, weight of broadside, speed in knots, and the reach of air power. It left out only one thing, because that one thing appears in no reference book. In 6 minutes, the Old Lady will rewrite the history of naval warfare. The first man to understand it will be the admiral on the bridge of the Cesare, certain of his advantage only a second before. Before we understand why she was written off too soon, it is worth remembering what this ship had been in the last war. Warspite was launched in 1913, and 3 years later, in May of 1916, she found herself in the very heart of Jutland. Jutland was the largest naval battle of the First World War. And there, something happened to her that entered the history of the fleet. A German shell jammed her steering gear, and the ship, out of control, began to carve wide circles straight toward the German line. Think about what that meant. An enormous battleship wheeling helplessly in circles under the concentrated fire of the entire enemy line. She was hit by more than a dozen heavy shells. Her hull was holed in many places. 14 of her crew were killed. And that same uncontrolled dance, by drawing all the German fire onto herself, drew it away from the other British ships nearby. Warspite endured what should have killed her, steamed out of the battle under her own power, and came home alive. That was the reputation this ship carried into the new war. She was no paper museum exhibit. She was a battleship that had once already taken killing fire and stayed afloat. But more than 20 years had passed between the wars. Aviation had grown. Brand new fast battleships had appeared. And against all that fresh steel, the veteran of Jutland once again looked like the last century. Air power advocates called her a floating museum. Treasury accountants asked why the Admiralty had poured more than £2 million into rebuilding an old ship. And here is what matters. By the summer of 1940, Warspite had already proven she had been written off too soon. 3 months before Calabria, on the 13th of April 1940, during the German invasion of Norway, the old battleship steamed straight into the narrow Ofotfjord near Narvik, escorted by 9 destroyers. In the tight water of the fjord, where a large ship can barely turn, Warspite and her destroyers destroyed all 8 German destroyers, stranded there without fuel. And a float-plane Swordfish, catapulted from the battleship herself, bombed and sank a German submarine at anchor in a side fjord. It became the first aircraft in history to sink a submarine from a battleship. That same biplane had spotted one of the German destroyers lying in ambush beforehand. In other words, the ship the air power men called a museum had, 3 months before Calabria, won a battle single-handed in a Norwegian fjord, and her own aircraft had sunk a submarine. The Treasury accountant's question had already been answered. The Italian staff simply had not read it. To understand why the outcome was decided by something other than steel, you first have to understand the balance of forces in the Mediterranean. Italy declared war on Britain and France on the 10th of June, 1940, and within weeks the central Mediterranean became contested water. Mussolini believed his Regia Marina could close that basin to British shipping, and he had reason to. The Italian fleet at that moment was the 4th largest navy in the world. 2 brand-new fast battleships of the Littorio class were entering service. 6 heavy cruisers carried 8-inch guns. Italy had numerical superiority, geographic position, and shore-based air cover from Sicily and Sardinia. But behind that impressive facade hid a crack no one liked to speak of aloud. Of Italy's 6 capital ships, the 4 newest were still being refitted, and only the 2 oldest battleships were in full fighting readiness. Chronic fuel shortage kept the fleet from long operations. What is more, the Italian Naval Command, Marina, had no real appetite for challenging the Royal Navy at the very start of the war. The chief of the naval staff, Cavagnari, feared a major sea battle even before Italy entered the war. He urged Mussolini to postpone it at least until autumn. A fleet that, on paper, was the terror of the Mediterranean was, inside itself, afraid of war with the British before the first shot was fired. The British Mediterranean Fleet, under Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, held Alexandria with 3 old battleships, 1 aircraft carrier, and a screen of cruisers and destroyers. Cunningham flew his flag in Warspite. Cunningham himself deserves a word, because the man was the exact opposite of the cautious Marina. In the Royal Navy, he was seen as an heir to the tradition of Nelson, to seek battle and force a fight on the enemy at every opportunity. Later, when he was urged not to risk his ships evacuating the army from Crete under air attack, he would speak a line that became famous. "It takes the Navy 3 years to build a ship," he said, "but 300 years to build a tradition." He would not abandon the soldiers to save the ships. That was the man standing on Warspite's bridge, a commander who wanted the very battle the Italian fleet feared. His brief from the Admiralty was short: keep Malta supplied, keep Egypt safe, and if the Italian fleet ever showed itself in daylight, force an engagement. Cunningham wanted that fight with all his heart. The trouble was that by every written rule, his flagship could not win it at long range. The Italian flagship, Giulio Cesare, was no antique either. Laid down in 1910, she had undergone a comprehensive rebuilding from 33 to 37. Less than half her original hull remained. Everything else was new. New boilers, new turbines, nearly 28 knots on trial, 10 guns of about 13-inch caliber, bored out from the original 12-inch. On paper, she threw a heavier shell at higher velocity. On paper, her stereoscopic rangefinders were more accurate. On paper, she had the advantage in speed. But it was exactly in that paper that the error lay. Between 1934 and 37, the British Admiralty had quietly turned Warspite into something her original designers would not have recognized. The reconstruction at Portsmouth cost £2,363,000, almost the price of a new ship. The bet was simple. For a fifth of the price of a new battleship, an old hull was made into a modern weapon. The bet rested on 3 decisions. First, the propulsion. The old First World War boilers came out, new ones went in. The ship became lighter by more than 1,000 tons, and the saved weight went into armor and equipment. Fuel consumption at high speed fell by nearly half, and her range grew so much that she could steam many thousands of miles without refueling. Second, the protection. More than 1,000 tons of additional horizontal armor went onto her decks. This protected the ship for the first time against the plunging long-range fire that Jutland had taught the Royal Navy to fear. Third, and most important, the fire control system. The main gun's elevation was raised from 20 degrees to 30. This extended their range far beyond the fighting distance of any modern battleship in service. But range alone means nothing without the ability to hit. And here, the Admiralty bet everything. The thing that decided those 6 minutes did not fire and carried no armor. It sat deep in the hull, in the transmitting station, and it was called the Admiralty Fire Control Table, Mark 7. In essence, it was an electromechanical analog computer, a set of gyroscopes, shafts, cams, and gears inside a steel cabinet. Data flowed into it from several rangefinders at once, from the director tower above the bridge, from the spotting top, from each of the 4 gun turrets. Each rangefinder had a 15-foot base, giving the optical precision the machine required. The table took the range to the target, the rate at which it was changing, the enemy's course and speed, the motion of its own ship. It also accounted for the temperature of the propellant, the wear of the barrels, the drift of the shell in the wind, and a dozen ballistic corrections. It ground it all into a single solution, and in real time drove the elevation and training of every turret. The gun layers simply matched pointers on dials. The machine did all the mathematics. Here, one detail is worth stressing, because it is often missed. At Calabria, Warspite carried no radar. None. Radar would reach her only in 1941, during a refit on the American coast. Off Punta Stilo, every range, every bearing, every fall of shot was obtained by trained human eyes through optics, then computed by the gears and cams inside the steel cabinet. And here lies the thing the Italian staff could enter into none of their tables. This machine never tired. It did not lose its place in the solution under fire. It did not panic in the 4th minute of battle. The man at the optics could waver. The gears behind the steel did not. The men who fed that machine deserve mention too. Warspite's gunners came from the Royal Navy's school on Whale Island at Portsmouth, founded back in 1830. Before that school existed, the Royal Navy had no unified system for training gunners at all, and each captain drilled his crews as best he could. Whale Island changed that. By 1940, it had trained several generations of British gunnery officers. Live firing, director control, and salvo correction had long become reflex for them. Officers from around the world came there to learn. The Italian Regia Marina had no school of comparable depth or continuity. The two fleets solved the same problem differently. One hoped to solve it with steel. The other spent years teaching men and machines to calculate faster. There was one last advantage the Cesare gave no thought to at all. In Warspite's hangar sat float-plane Swordfish, slow fabric biplanes, each with a wireless set and a trained observer aboard. Such a biplane could climb to 10,000 feet, watch the enemy ships from above, and radio back where the shells were falling. In effect, the old battleship carried her own gunnery spotter in the cold air above the battle itself. 27 years to the hull, and yet the most advanced gunnery brain any battleship in the world carried in 1940. The doubters had missed it entirely. If this look at how the Royal Navy won with its head first, the guns following after, is of interest to you, you already understand whether it is worth staying to the end. The operation began on the 7th of July, when Cunningham sailed from Alexandria to cover convoys and, if possible, draw the Italian fleet into battle. On the 8th of July, a Sunderland flying boat reported the Italian fleet at sea, 200 miles to the west, escorting a troop convoy to Libya. Cunningham closed the range all night. By noon, on the 9th of July, the two fleets were converging east of Calabria. Visibility was excellent, the sea slight. The British fleet moved in 3 groups. Ahead, the cruisers, with a destroyer screen. In the center, Warspite, with 5 destroyers. Behind, the main body, 2 slower battleships, the carrier Eagle, and 11 destroyers. At 15 hours 8 minutes, the cruiser Neptune sighted 2 Italian battleships 15 miles off. Cunningham ordered the fleet to close, but his 2 old, slow battleships were lagging, and the admiral did the thing that decided the whole battle. He would not wait for them and surged ahead on Warspite alone, leaving the main body to catch up. On the other side, the Italian fleet was commanded by Admiral Inigo Campioni, and he had his own logic. He was not seeking an immediate duel. He was drawing the British closer to his own airfields and submarine positions near the Calabrian coast. High command in Rome demanded that he attack one of the 2 ships facing him. Campioni held the range and led his enemy toward the trap. The first to engage, in fact, were the light forces. Around 15 hours 15 minutes, the leading British cruisers sighted the Italian main body. Both sides opened fire at more than 21,000 meters. And here, it is only fair to say something that cuts against the convenient picture. The Italian rangefinders in this first phase performed better than the British. In just 3 minutes, the Italian cruisers found the range, even firing at extreme distance, and their shells began to fall dangerously close. Vice Admiral John Tovey, commanding the British cruisers, decided to turn away. A splinter from a 6-inch shell fired by the Italian cruiser Giuseppe Garibaldi damaged Neptune's catapult and wrecked her reconnaissance aircraft. So in the first minutes of battle, the Italian optics showed better. The difference came later, when the battleship's main batteries entered the fight, and the steel computer deep in Warspite turned a found range into a hit. At 15 hours 48 minutes, Warspite catapulted a Swordfish. The biplane climbed to 10,000 feet to spot the fall of shot from above. Everything was ready for the one thing the Italian calculation had not foreseen. At 15 hours 52 minutes, the Giulio Cesare opened fire. Her shells fell short and wide. By Italian standards, the shooting was decent. By Royal Navy standards, the dispersion was unforgivable. At 15 hours 59 minutes, Warspite replied. The target was the right hand of the 2 Italian battleships. The range was 26,000 yards, almost 15 statute miles. At that distance, before the 9th of July 1940, no battleship in history had scored a confirmed hit on a moving battleship. The Italians did not believe it could be done at all. The Royal Navy had never tried it in combat. The mathematics said the odds against a hit were astronomical, and that mathematics had been placed behind a steel cabinet in the transmitting station. For the next 6 minutes, Warspite salvos walked across the sea toward the Cesare. Each shell weighed 1,938 pounds and hung in the air about 45 seconds before plunging down from 13,000 feet. The table tracked the Cesare through smoke and turns. The observer in the Swordfish radioed corrections. The gun layers adjusted the barrels by fractions of a degree. The straddles tightened around the target. At 16 hours exactly came the salvo that mattered. A 15-inch armor-piercing shell struck the afterdeck of the Cesare and set off the ready ammunition stored there for her anti-aircraft guns. Fire and splinters did the rest. Smoke and burning debris were drawn down through the air intakes into the boiler rooms. The men there had to save themselves, shutting down the boilers. Half of her 8 boilers were put out of action. For 30 seconds, power failed across the entire ship. The Cesare's speed dropped from 27 knots to 18. Direct casualties were few, 2 killed and several wounded, but the fighting value of the flagship collapsed in that 1 second. Look at the 2 columns side by side. In one column, everything that can be measured: heavier shell, higher speed, better rangefinders, air power close at hand. In the other column, one thing that cannot be measured: the ability to calculate faster and more accurately than the enemy under fire. By 16 hours, the first column was worth nothing at all. The second had put the flagship of the fascist fleet out of the fight with a single shell. This was not the victory of new armor over old. This was the victory of calculation over assumption. Admiral Campioni, watching all of this from the bridge of the Cesare, made the only decision left to him. At 16 hours 3 minutes, he ordered his battleships to break off. Italian destroyers laid a smokescreen. At 16 hours 4 minutes, Warspite ceased fire. The Italian fleet withdrew behind smoke at full speed toward Messina. What came next shows better than any lecture the state the Italian side was in. The Italian air arm, put aloft, 150 aircraft strong, came out to bomb. In the confusion, 50 of them bombed their own fleet. They hit none of their own ships, fortunately for the Italians, just as they hit none of the British. More than 500 bombs were dropped over both fleets, and 1 aircraft was lost to their own anti-aircraft fire. Cunningham pursued for another hour until his fleet came within 25 miles of the Calabrian coast. The threat of land-based bombers became unacceptable, and he broke off the chase. In his dispatch, he wrote that the hit at 26,000 yards might perhaps be described as lucky. But within the Royal Navy, luck was understood differently. Good shooting produced straddles, and straddles produced hits. Warspite had achieved both. The Italian flagship had achieved neither. If you count the Battle of Calabria on a table of losses, it was a draw. The Cesare was repaired at La Spezia in under a month. Not a single ship on either side was sunk. On the spreadsheet of naval combat, where only tonnage counts, it was an even exchange. But the true result of that draw does not fit on a table of losses. High command in Rome ordered the fleet henceforth to be conserved and committed to daylight action more cautiously. The Regia Marina would never again accept battle at long range against the Mediterranean fleet on equal terms. A fleet that in the summer of 1940 had been the 4th largest in the world began to avoid battle before battle even began. The cause was not one shell alone. It was in how that shell fell. The Italian flagship opened fire first, shot decently by its own standards, and achieved nothing. The British museum piece replied and, with its first series of straddles, put the enemy out of the fight. For a fleet that had built all its confidence on the paper superiority of its ships, that shell struck not so much the Cesare as the very belief that paper superiority was enough. The confidence rested on numbers, and the numbers did not work. There was an inner price, too, one you cannot measure in knots and inches. The old quarrel between the Italian Navy and the Italian Air Force only grew nastier after Calabria. The airmen reported imaginary victories, and the sailors, whose ships those same airmen had just bombed, gained a new and very weighty argument. They argued the fleet needed its own naval air arm. Allied propaganda, meanwhile, convinced Italy itself that it had lost outright, and Italian ships grew ever more reluctant to leave port. So was born the strategy of a fleet that exists, but does not fight. Now look at where that caution led only a few months later. 4 months on the night of the 12th of November 1940, the same Cunningham launched 21 Swordfish torpedo bombers. They struck the Italian fleet lying at anchor in the harbor of Taranto. 3 battleships were put out of action in one night. The Cesare's sister, the battleship Conte di Cavour, was sunk in shallow water and never returned to service. The very fleet that after Calabria had chosen to preserve its ships in port received them right there in that port. The belief in its own invulnerability had not gone anywhere. It had simply moved from the open sea into the harbor. A few months after Taranto, in March of 1941, off Cape Matapan, Warspite was once again at the center of events. In a night action at almost point-blank range, the same old lady destroyed 3 Italian heavy cruisers. The fleet that, after Calabria, feared a daylight battle at range, lost its finest cruisers at night, at pistol-shot distance. Calabria in itself was a draw, but it was Calabria that sowed the caution, the fear of battle. Out of that fear grew both Taranto and Matapan. One shell from 14 miles sank not a single ship, and yet it broke an entire fleet for years to come. And beneath all of it lay the one miscalculation now fully visible. The Italian side had measured everything that can be measured: armor, weight of broadside, speed, the reach of air power. It had not measured the one thing that decided the outcome, because that thing appears in no reference book: the training of the men, and the cold head of a machine that calculates faster than a man under fire. A defense built only on measurable numbers holds exactly until it meets someone who has learned to calculate what the numbers cannot capture. The last word in this story stayed with the old lady herself. Admiral Cunningham, whose flag she carried that day, would go with her through the whole Mediterranean War. In 1943, he would call her the Grand Old Lady, and that name would stay with the ship forever. Cunningham himself would rise to First Sea Lord, the very top of the entire Royal Navy. But it was this old battleship that stayed in his memory above all. And the ship fought on and earned what no other ship in the history of the Royal Navy earned: 15 battle honors, more than any ship in the British fleet. Jutland in the last war, and 14 actions in this one. At Crete, a dive bomber nearly finished her. At Salerno, German guided bombs nearly sank her, but she returned to service again and again. On the 6th of June 1944, off the coast of Normandy, Warspite fired the first British naval gunfire of the invasion day. She shot at German batteries, though she herself had not by then been properly repaired. And then the war ended, and the Grand Old Lady was condemned to the breakers. In 1947, she was taken under tow toward a scrapyard. On the way, a storm tore her free of the tow line and cast her onto the rocks off the coast of Cornwall. The ship that had fought from Jutland to Normandy would not go quietly to the breakers, even in death. She had to be broken up right where she lay, refusing to be led on a rope to her last journey. Even the Giulio Cesare, that flagship whose paper superiority decided nothing at Calabria, met a strange end. She survived the whole war, and after it, in 1948, she was handed to the Soviet Union as reparations. Under the name Novorossiysk, she served in the Black Sea, became fleet flagship, then a gunnery training ship. On the night of the 29th of October 1955, lying at anchor in Sevastopol Bay, she blew up and capsized, most probably from an old German mine left over from the war. More than 600 men died with her. The battleship that the numbers on paper could not save in battle survived the war only to die from a rusted echo of that same war. At anchor in another Navy's fleet, the Italian staff, in the summer of 1940, counted everything that can be weighed and measured. They concluded that the old battleship would lose. It was not the old battleship that lost. What lost was the very belief that war at sea is won by whoever has the larger numbers in the reference book.